1980s, a new group of leaders were beginning to emerge who challenged the notion that busing was the only way to achieve quality education. Indeed, these leaders would have been condemned in the 1960s and the early 1970s, and I'll talk about some of those leaders in a minute. Well, actually, let me discuss one right now. James Kelly. Many of you know James Kelly as the head of the Urban League. James Kelly, in 1988, founded an organization called the Black Community Coalition, which focused specifically on the achievement gap. Kelly said, and he said something that increasingly was going to resonate with a number of black parents, that closing the achievement gap was more important than desegregating the schools. Closing the achievement gap was far more important than the money that was spent for busing at the time. Eventually, he would call for the creation of the African American Academy. And the African American Academy would be one bold measure. It would be an attempt to try to create an academically wholesome environment where African American students would thrive. We can talk later in the question and answer sessions about whether that was achieved, but nonetheless, that was the goal in the early 1990s. The Academy opened in 1991, and of course, you can see the groundbreaking for the finished building that was completed by the year 2001. And of course, many of you may be familiar with the African American Academy. Unfortunately, though, African American Academy aside, the white flight continued from the school districts. In other words, white students were continuing to leave the school district, but now white flight had morphed into what I call middle class flight, as black and Asian parents also took their kids out of the public schools as well. Indeed, you couldn't even go to a private school and be assured of an education with nothing but white students. By 1990, 1 in 5 private school students was a student of color. 1 in 5 private school students was a student of color. In other words, the middle class had pretty well effectively deserted the public schools of Seattle. I think there are 2 comments that indicate the changed attitudes and their consequences. Earl Detman, chairman of the African American Parents Council, told the school board hearing in 1990 that the black parents in the Central District now agreed with white parents in the North End that, quote, the ability to choose schools closer to home is far more important than desegregation. School board president Al Sugiyama, the first Asian American board member, said, and I'm quoting here, the mandatory busing program interferes with the district's efforts to improve poor schools and reduce the achievement gap. By 1995, the major opponents of school busing on the Seattle School Board were Michael Preston and Al Sugiyama. In other words, a black man and an Asian American man. They would soon be joined by a crucial ally, the new superintendent of public schools, John Stanford. Stanford was a retired general. You know the story. I mean, you guys were here when Stanford was here. He was a retired general with absolutely no experience in running public schools, and yet some have argued, not me, some have argued that he was the most dynamic public school superintendent that we've had. Certainly he shook things up, and certainly he was probably the only one who could in effect take us away, or take the city and take the school board away from the idea of busing. In October of 1997, Stanford proposed the end to the district's 20-year-old program of mandatory busing. To address the achievement gap, Stanford introduced a new school financing formula that promised more money for low-income students. On November 5th, 1997, the Seattle School Board voted 6-1 to end mandatory school busing. Folks, very few people mourn the passing of mandatory school busing. The Seattle Times, which is the most vocal proponent of mandatory busing throughout those years, had this editorial comment on July 30th, 1995, 2 years before the vote. How then do we assess this 20-year experiment? And remember those words, 20-year experiment. In other words, from 1977 to 1997, the city of Seattle dedicated itself to mandatory school busing to try to bring about racial balance. How do we assess this 20-year experience? Well, there is one group, indeed, and this group is fairly large, who believe that this experiment was a complete failure. Former Seattle School Superintendent David Moberly, the official who ushered into existence the first busing plan, said in 1987, quote, some people sincerely believed that busing would result in better education. Yet there was never any evidence anywhere at all that it did. While Moberly is correct, I believe, and I'm going to go out on dangerous ground here, but I believe that there were positive outcomes that flowed from this desegregation effort. Yes, overall, busing was problematic. Overall, mandatory busing was not supported by significant segments of the population everywhere. But I believe this 20-year experiment did have some positives, that flowed from it. First, desegregation, whether through mandatory busing or other means, desegregation ended the isolation of Seattle's black kids. Desegregation, let me repeat that, desegregation ended the isolation, the racial isolation of Seattle's black kids. No longer could Seattle students claim a geographic ignorance, and particularly black students, a geographic ignorance about the rest of the city. In other words, before busing and before the attempt to integrate the schools, there had been, if you will, a kind of parochialism in the schools. People identified with schools and neighborhoods, and they didn't see beyond those schools and beyond those neighborhoods. Busing, for all of its faults, got those kids out of those neighborhoods and moved them into large areas of the city so that they would begin to know and understand the city in ways that their predecessors could never imagine. Secondly, I believe the busing may have reduced the pressure to maintain segregated neighborhoods. Now, busing wasn't a complete panacea in this regard. There was still going to be, attempts to maintain segregation. But I think eventually, as blacks moved throughout the city, one of the reasons they would be accepted in various areas is precisely because their kids were indeed going to school with kids of other races throughout the city as well. In other words, busing itself and school desegregation paved the way for residential integration. It should have been the other way around. Had there been residential integration to begin with, there would have been no need for busing. But at least in this instance, busing at least will be indirectly responsible for the rise of residential integration. Thirdly, the desegregation efforts opened educational opportunities and experiences of the entire city to each student. Theoretically, students from throughout the city could avail themselves of special programs. Now here we're talking about the magnet schools. And yes, they had plenty of critics, and some of the critics were probably right in their arguments. But the magnet schools, and Garfield was one of them, the magnet schools created an environment, created a situation whereby gifted students, whereby students with special talents and special needs got the attention and care that they did not receive prior to 1965. Fourthly, although the evidence is less certain here, I'm on shaky ground here, I believe that desegregation helped to prepare Seattle for an array of black office holders, including a black mayor, a black county executive, a black school board president, a series of black school board presidents, I should say, and of course a black school board superintendent. Folks, I would argue that the rise of these office holders in the 1980s and 1990s, some of whom are sitting in this room, the rise of these office holders, I think, would have been much more difficult, much more problematic, had not busing sort of convulsed the city. Indeed, there are various ways of looking at this. In one way, African Americans became political actors, even if they were moving in different directions. They became political actors across the city as a whole in ways that were unimagined in the 1950s and the 1960s. But another way of looking at this is to suggest that the desegregation of the schools, no matter how they came about, prompted people all over the city to begin to think about African American politicians and activists in different ways. Now, all of these changes, however, were not enough to deal with or to overcome the trauma of busing itself. Yet, I will argue that there were those who, even to this day, will claim the benefit of busing. I'm going to conclude this lecture with the statement of these two young women. They are veterans of busing. I don't know if you know them. It's probably not important for you to know them, but know their words. These are two Seattleites who remember busing. The development of these sentiments are wonderful. I laud them. I think it's very important I think they're very important. I think they reflect the racial progress that we've made. Racial progress that would have been very hard to imagine in 1965, 1966, or even 1972. Nonetheless, As I stand before you tonight, I understand that one of the major promises of busing, one of the major promises of mandatory busing, the idea of improved black performance, has still not been achieved. It has not been achieved right to this day, and we don't know, we really don't know when that will take place. Maybe someday in the future, when someone else comes and gives a lecture, they can tell you a happy ending to the story. They can tell you how the achievement gap was ended. But tonight, we're not prepared to do so. Thank you very much. We have some time for questions. Do we have time for questions? We have some time for questions. I have a feeling I'm going to get a lot of questions. I think I've managed to make a lot of people angry tonight. Questions? Have I made you so angry that you're not going to raise any questions? Yes. Yes.
Professor Taylor, my name is Larry Gossett, and
I know. I know. Larry's one of the politicians.
Yeah, and I was one of the founders of the University of Washington Black Student Union in 1968. And I had a question about that part of your lecture. Mm-hmm. It sounded like you were saying that those who were advocating for black power were kind of reinforcing racial segregation. And mm-hmm. I never remembered at that mm-hmm. time that we talked anything about maintaining segregation. Mm-hmm. We thought that the advocacy of black power was the only way that we can move toward a more truly integrated society. Mm-hmm. All of us went to an overwhelmingly black university, this mm-hmm. one. I mean, white university, excuse me, this one. Mm-hmm. And even out here, we were saying what we need to do is integrate mm-hmm. the curriculum, mm-hmm. integrate the staff, integrate the cultural, social, and academic structures on this campus so that they were warmer, less hostile, mm-hmm. and more open to people from diverse experiences. Mm-hmm. When we advocated in the community, we said the main thing is to have more control over the schools so that our children, black children, and other students of color could have a quality education. The ideal of segregation, maintaining segregation, never came up. So I'd like for you to mm-hmm. Am I wrong in my interpretation?
I think you're probably wrong in your interpretation. Okay. If that's that's the idea that people came away with, then I apologize, because that's certainly not what we were saying. But I think in your question and in the response, I think is embedded a great truth. I think most of the black power advocates were not concerned about integration or segregation. They were concerned about empowerment. They were concerned about control. They were concerned about the progress of the African American community. And I think that's where they came into conflict with a lot of people who were integrationists, who often dismissed them as people who were supportive of segregation. Therein lies the problem. But I understand. I think I understand. Again, I've lived through this period. I was part of this period. And that's part of the problem of talking about this history. We're all part of this period. You all lived through this. You all experienced these things. You guys, in this room, there are people who probably had children who were bused. I don't want to see a show of hands, but I know that in this room, there are people who had children. And maybe in this room, there are people who themselves were bused. And of course, you have your own feelings about the whole question of busing. The real issue for, and this is, Larry, this is where I think the dilemma is. The real issue for both the integrationists and the black power advocates was, how do you bring about effective education for African American students? It was very clear that the Seattle school system was not delivering that effective education in 1960, 1961, 1965. The question is, how will it deliver it? What are the strategies to be promoted to try to bring about the effective delivery of that education? And to be honest with you, I don't know if we've figured it out. That's the dilemma. I don't know if we've actually, even now, even in the year 2006, I don't know if we've figured out how to end the achievement gap. I don't know if we've figured out how to to ensure the black kids have the educational opportunity so that more of them can be at the University of Washington. The goal that you wanted, the goal that the Black Student Union wanted at the time, has still not been achieved, but it was also the goal of the integrationists, and it hasn't been achieved. And so that's the dilemma that I wrestle with, and to be honest with you, I hope it's the dilemma that you wrestle with, because these problems are not ancient history. What we're talking about right now is a dilemma that continues. What we're talking about right now is not what happened in the 1960s. And I could regale you with stories of heroic people from the 1960s, and you'd feel good about this. What we're talking about is the fact that the civil rights movement of the 1960s did not solve all of the problems, that we have a residue of those problems, huge problems, that continue right to this day. There are some who argue, I won't necessarily say that I do, but there are some who argue that the most salient, the most important question, the most critical question, the most crucial question in American society today is the question of race. The most crucial question is the question of race. How do we resolve that? Hey, if I could tell you that, if I could tell you the solution, I'd be sitting in the White House. All the way over there.
I found it fascinating that when you talked about the schools and you talked about the private schools, that somehow all the people who've taken themselves out of the Seattle School District have managed to actually create, in the private school system, if you will, both integration and a level of educational parity. So I don't know who I don't even know that this is a question for you, but what are they doing that this, well, okay.
I don't know. Maybe there's a commitment, and the commitment includes a commitment of resources. Let me give you an example. If I haven't gotten in trouble with a lot of people tonight, I will right now. let me name names. There's an example called Lakeside. Many of you are familiar with Lakeside School, are you not? Some of you may have actually even graduated from Lakeside. What is fascinating about Lakeside is that 25 years ago, it was almost lily white. There were relatively few black folks there. Lakeside is now, despite the fact that it costs an arm and a leg to go there, Lakeside is now one of the most integrated schools, racially integrated schools in the city of Seattle. So it sort of speaks to the question that you can have quality education and racial integration. Those two ideas are not mutually exclusive. How is it that Lakeside can do it, and I realize that they do have certain resources, but how is it that Lakeside can do it and we can't do it in the public schools of Seattle? And remember, there was a time when it was assumed that that's exactly the role of the public schools, that the public schools would take people with very few resources and turn them into productive citizens. And somehow or another, we've gotten away from that. I think she may have the answer. We'll take her question, and then this has to be the last one.
I think I have at least one of the answers. At the time that I was in school, I graduated in '85, Lakeside was doing recruitment. And I can't remember if that's the exact one that was called the LEAP program, but they had a program that in the summer would invite minority students to come to the school and take courses over the course of the summer and just get a taste of what the school is about. Scholarship was offered, or like at half the cost of coming to school. If you could come up with that money, and your parents were like, hey, let's do it. You're off and running at Lakeside.
Yeah, yeah, no.
I don't know how long they did that program, but that's what was happening when I was between my 8th and 9th grade year. So that's who it was targeted at, was those middle school students.
No, I can't disagree with you on that. I think that's probably the case. The problem, though, is practical, that everybody can't go to Lakeside, that there are large numbers of students, and everybody shouldn't have to go to Lakeside to receive a quality education. Every one of us in this room pays taxes into public school coffers, and I believe, I assume, that we pay for the best possible education, and yet we're not getting that. And I think we need to redouble our efforts so that we can make, I know this may seem so far-fetched, not necessarily make every public school like Lakeside, but make every public school approach Lakeside in the sense of its dedication to educating all of the students. That's, I think, the goal that is achievable even in Seattle in the year 2006. Okay, we'll stop at that point then. Thank you.